Hi, this is Tara. Welcome to Sky Gazing. Today we're studying Sutra number 6 of the Sadhana Pada, which is the second book of Patanjali's Yogasutras. We're studying it through 6 bhashyas. Let's look at what it says. Driga darshana shaktyo eka atmata aiva asmita. Drish to see, darshana is the view, what you're seeing. Shakti is power, eka is one, atmata is nature or essence, aiva as it were, asmita is the feeling of self, I-ness. So Maharishi Ved Vyasa explains it as egoism is the appearance of identity in the natures of the subjective power of consciousness and the instrumental power of seeing. So the purusha is the subjective power of consciousness. Egoism is the appearance of identity in the natures of the subjective power of consciousness and the instrumental power of seeing. So let's understand these two concepts. Subjective power of consciousness is purusha. What is the instrumental power of seeing? It is that by which we perceive, which is the intellect of buddhi. So the appearance of these two powers as if they were one is what becomes egotism or asmita. So enjoyment is possible when the power of enjoyment in the enjoyer and the capacity of being enjoyed in the objective existence, which are quite distinct and different from each other. In other words, like bhokta. When, however, their natures have been understood, they become isolated. How can there be enjoyment? And so it has been said, not knowing the Purusha beyond the will to know, to be different therefrom in nature, character, and knowledge, a man has by forgetfulness the notion of self therein. So basically, what he's saying is that one can see, one can enjoy, one can perceive, one can taste, but do not mistake this tasting, this perceiving for the self. And I think this is a very important sutra in terms of meditation. Because in all our meditations, we are perceiving, we assume a higher self. And when we perceive even a glimpse, those of us who are very, very shallow in our meditations, and you reach that one moment of tranquility, of melting away, of ananda, of nothingness, of stillness, even for a flash, we assume that we are perceiving. But as we have understood, which is why the Samadhi Pada is so important, because when you actually reach that state of Samadhi, there is no sense of separation of I am perceiving the state of Samadhi. There is complete absorption, there is oneness. So we are still at a very, very rudimentary level. But the misconception, and this is why the mind, the conceptual mind is a trickster, because it's making you believe that you have achieved sorry, excuse me, some level of accomplishment in this task, and that becomes spiritual ego, because you're saying I have reached the state of absorption, of samadhi, of tranquility. But if you had really reached that state of absorption, tranquility, samadhi, there would not be the separation from the I, there would be complete absorption. And therefore the ego rises there, that becomes asmita. Swami Satyananda says asmita is the identity, as it were, of the purusha with the buddhi. So the awareness of I am is mixed with existence, with the body, actions, and mind. It is as if a prince in the garb of a beggar is identifying with the role he is playing. This is asmita. When the inner consciousness, representing the highest truth in man, asserts itself through the medium of the body, the buddhi, and the senses, it is asmita. It has different stages. Swami Satyananda is explaining the stages of identifying with the body. In the case of a primitive person, he says, with an underdeveloped intellect, which is, I think, me, asmita is rooted in identification with the body. An intellectually developed person identifies with the higher functions of the mind. So asmita is a consciousness. But when he says an intellectually developed person identifies with the higher functions of mind, you and I will immediately think, oh, I'm a very intellectual person. I'm a thinking person. I've always been described as a writer, as an intellectual, as a reader, as a thinker. See what I'm doing. I'm meditating. I'm contemplating. I'm doing yoga. I'm studying scriptures. There, Asmita goes. right? Because you have, that is exactly the point of the sutra, that we are identifying with the buddhi. Again, that brings us back to square one. So Asmita is a consciousness which identifies the purusha with its vehicle. For example, when we see the buses coming, we really mean the bus is being driven by the driver. We don't think that the bus is the key thing. So buddhi is the vehicle, and so are the senses. The Atman or Purusha does the work of cognition. Swami Satyananda's examples are so spot on. So he's saying, if this is, you're basically identifying the bus. So the power of seeing, thinking, all of this belongs to the Purusha, but this power is transmitted to the Buddhi and the senses. So it is not that I am an intellectual, but that the Purusha has the manifest function of perception, of seeing, of analyzing, of understanding, is all just a manifestation of Purusha. So this conception of blending together is called Asmita. It is the Shakti, the power of Purusha, which does the thinking, the seeing. But this is shifted to the vehicle, and it appears as if the eyes are seeing, etc. When the Purusha is realized, then there is no identification of the Purusha with the body or with the intellect, but we are not aware of this fact. And this non-awareness is called Asmita. He explains that in the Kenopanishad, it is said that it is the power of the self, the Atma, by which the ears hear and the eyes see, the pranas move, and the mind thinks. In fact, I will just share this. I was attending a lecture by a master who was explaining the stages of death. Okay. And the first thing that he says goes is gravity. Okay. And how that functions is, if you ask yourself, okay, consciousness, Atma, Purusha is the perceiver, is the real seer. But how does that consciousness segregate the power of sight to the eyes, taste to the mouth, and sound to the ears? Why is it segregated? Right? How does it know if it's just one consciousness? So what happens in the first stage of death? First thing to go is that segregation. So suddenly consciousness is one, right? As it's leaving the body, the consciousness stops segregating into these sections and it becomes basically one. And thus the whole consciousness perceives, the whole consciousness sees and hears and tastes. So it's not like your foot can see, because the segregation of the body no longer applies to the consciousness. Just an aside, I found this a very fascinating aspect, and I was just thinking about it. But that is why when we identify, when we have this asmita, and we identify with the manifestation of the Purusha through the body, that's when mistaken ego arises. I am so great. I have cracked all these exams and I have written these articles and these books and I have achieved this and I have achieved that. I've achieved nothing that anybody else could not also have achieved, because the Purusha manifests through everybody and everything and every being. It is just manifesting through you in a certain way and manifesting through someone else in a certain way, depending on karmas, prarabdha, sanchita, all of that. Yes, agama. But the point is that the pride only arises when there's identification with the body and the I. Okay, my body, my intellect, my. But if you understand that all this is basically just a manifestation of Purusha, and it's like light, right? It will seep through any crack, and I just happen to be a crack, so the light is seeping through me at this point in time. Tomorrow it will seep through somebody else. So there is no call for spiritual pride, especially, you know. Okay, Swami Satyananda says. These mantras of the Kenopanishad clearly indicate the distinction between the power of cognition, that is Drig Shakti, and its vehicle, Darshana Shakti. The power of seeing cannot be realized even through reading philosophy or through hearing great scholars. Even the philosophers and thinkers identify the Purusha with the body and buddhi in actual experience. So it is not possible to overcome Asmita through the intellect. It can only be done through meditation. It happens in meditation that something comes out of you and you see it. Ramana Maharshi had this kind of experience at a very young age. He saw his own dead body in meditation, and he also saw that he was observing his own dead body. So there were three persons: the dead body, the seer of the body, and the seer of the seer. So Asmita is the blending together of this twofold or threefold principle. Most of us are in Asmita, and therefore it is said in the sutra that this particular aspect of Asmita is nothing but I am. Now, if you would point out to me the contradiction of the earlier thing of, why is Ramana Maharshi seeing three aspects when you just said that if you were genuinely in samadhi, you'd be seeing that complete absorption. When you and I become Ramana Maharshi, we can have those experiences, but right now we're not, right? So at our level, the separation is indicative of ignorance. At his level, the segregation is an aspect of layered perception. So there is a difference. Just clarifying that. So Asmita, he says, is the blending together of this twofold or threefold principle. Most of us are in Asmita, and it is nothing but I am. This I am is the identification of Atman with the lower principles. And he tells this story about Indra and Vairochana, who were both the kings of the gods and the Rakshasas. And both of them went to Prajapati to receive instruction. And he told them the two great instructions, which are basically Aham Brahmasmi, I am Brahman, and Tattvamasi, that thou art. So Vairochana mistook Aham for his body and was ultimately destroyed because of Asmita. Indra meditated upon the real meaning and became happy. Thus, if you're able to go higher in meditation, crossing avidya, you can realize the real nature of purusha. Over here, I also just want to explain that this is something that a lot of stories and scriptures keep explaining to us, though we take them only at a narrative level, which is that knowledge can be given to you and you can be a Ram or a Ravan because of it. So, for instance, there are people who will say that if you practice so much yoga, you must definitely be a good person. That's not necessarily true. The knowledge will release what it has to release in you. How you use it is up to you, because it's entirely possible to get mired in this sort of maze of the mind, to think that these conceptual traps are real, to see this hall of infinity mirrors that the mind will sort of erect. I mean, like Gautama Buddha, till he gained his enlightenment, was still battling Mara, who was, imposing self-doubt and questioning him and distracting him. So who are you and I? So, so the more you practice, the more you're going to be able to use that capacity, that knowledge, for good or bad, which is why we have so many people gone wrong, even though they know so much. So just knowledge in itself is not sufficient. There is also a need for wisdom. There's a need for compassion. There's a need to understand how to apply these things to our lives, and to think of others, which is why yamas and niyamas are the foundational force. The shilas in Buddhism, compassion in Vajrayana and Mahayana Buddhism, these are the grounding factors, the paramitas. So knowledge alone is not what um, assures liberation. It is also how that knowledge is applied and used. Okay, so he says that, and this is what he's saying, trying to explain to us with this Asmita and the story of Indra and Vairochana, that it becomes this Darth Vader, Luke Skywalker kind of story, right? At the end of the day, how you use those intentions, the intentions you set, and who and what you want to liberate along with yourself is really what matters. So he says that if you're able to cross this avidya and realize the real nature of purusha, asmita is transcended. And this is possible by two methods. One is the powerful but difficult method of dhyana, and the other is the analytical method of the jnana yogis, which was employed by Indra, but that method requires a purification of the heart and intellect. Thus, asmita, which is an offshoot of avidya, can be overcome. Swami Vivekananda says egoism is the identification of the seer with the instrument of seeing. The seer is the self, the pure one, the ever holy, infinite, immortal. That is the self of man. And what are the instruments? The instruments are chitta, that is the mind, buddhi, determinative factors, manas, mind, and the indriyan, that is the sense organs by which we experience or perceive the world. These are the instruments by which we um, access the external world. And the identification with any of these instruments is asmita or egotism. So we say, I am the mind, I am happy, I am hungry. But the consciousness, the pure consciousness, that is the purusha, the self, uh, is not hungry, is not needy, is not clingy, is not wanting, is not grasping, is not rejecting. So it cannot be, it is beyond all law. Nothing in the universe can produce an effect on it. Yet through ignorance, we identify ourselves with the mind stuff, mano, buddhi, chitta, ahankara, and think we feel pleasure and pain. BKS Iyengar says egoism is the identification of the seer with the instrumental power of seeing. And he gives the example of iron and coal. They are two different entities, but if you heat iron in fire, it will glow like just like coal. So also he says the body and eternal self are distinct entities, and the lack of knowledge makes one believe that they are one. Taking pride in the body or as the self is also avidya. Identifying the instruments of cognition, the senses of perception, intelligence, ego, the sense of the individual self with the pure seer is egotism or the conception of individuality. And note over here when he says, conception of individuality, this is where a lot of our philosophies are just the extreme polar opposite of everything that is Western, right? Because where individuality is highly prized. And the idea of freedom there is actually the establishment of individuality. And for us, the idea of freedom is the complete destruction of the idea of individuality, which is just fascinating. So he says that thought there is a distinction between the seer, the atma, and the seen during the act of seeing the seen, the mind itself. Okay, so he says that thought is a distinction between the seer, that is the atma, and the seen during the act of seeing. The seen, that is the mind itself, appears to be the pure seer. So during the act of perceiving, seeing an object, we are imagining that the mind which is doing this perception is the seer. And this is what gets even trickier in meditation. So, this appearance of merging or oneness is due to asmita. And one must be aware of the difference between the seer and the instrument that sees, the Atman and the Buddhi. If they blend and work together, that experience becomes reality. This is why, the Anapanasati is one of the greatest instruments of meditation ever taught, because it has four tetrads, and each of the four tetrads consciously and systematically, there are 16 steps. The Buddha establishes the distinction between these layers of the mind. Tetrad 3, tetrad 2 is of the perceptual mind, the chitta, and tetrad 3 is that which surpasses that. So there are many, I'm sure, systems. I mean, India has thousands of systems of meditation, but this awareness of the layers of the mind is very, very vital, not just for ascending in that process of meditation, but also to be, so as not to be tricked, so as not to get played by these conceptual traps. Yeah. So he says, but if the mind senses the seer's agents, take it upon themselves to identify with the true seer, as if the seer were manifest or apparent, then polarities are created, and the seer and seen become separated or split. This is asmita. Osho says the lack of awareness is to take the non-self for the self. These are the criteria. You have taken the non-self for the self. Sometimes you think you're the body, sometimes you think you're the mind, sometimes you think you're the heart. And these are the three traps. The body is the outermost layer. When you identify with the material needs, I am hungry, I am thirsty. And he says, food never enters the consciousness. So you are not. Okay. So okay, so the first layer is identifying with the body. The second layer is identifying with the mind, that is more subtle, nearer to consciousness. So the deception is a little more tricky. You take your mind to be yourself and you think, I am thinking, I have these running thoughts, or I have these accomplishments. And lack of awareness is if you get identified with the non self and think it is the self. The third stage is the heart, the nearest to consciousness, but still far away. There is body, thought, and feeling. When you feel, you have to be very, very aware that it is not you who feels. And this is very hard because we identify with emotions so strongly. Um, People can break our heart and we feel like, oh my God, I'm hurting. But it takes a certain amount of abhyasa vairagya to be established in the thought that it is not I who is hurting. And just in terms of asana, I want to say all three of these, the way they apply, when the body aches, the body pains, it feels pain. And it's easy to say, but the practice is to stand in that posture and say, it is the body that is paining, it is mind that is reacting with this emotion, it is the heart that is feeling this emotional impact. But and also the heart also that releases the emotional impact through asana, because the us holding the posture sort of touches pockets which allows that emotion to release intensely. So it is through asana that we attain this sort of practice of grounding ourselves in the neti principle. I am not this, I am not this, I am not this. Okay. So Barbara Stoller Miller says ignorance is perceiving permanence and transience, purity and impurity, pleasure and suffering, an essential self where there is no self. So for Patanjali, ignorance is the basis of corrupting forces, egoism, passion, hatred, will to live, that is Asmita, Raga, Dvesha, and Abhinivesha. Egoism is a false sense of self that comes about when we misidentify our essential nature with the material world. Passion and hatred flourish when we mistakenly define ourselves in terms of past pleasures and miseries, so that attachment to our memories of these experiences produces in us extreme feelings of desire and malice. So this was Sutra number 2.6. I still think one of the best ways to understand the Sutra is Atma Shatakam or Nirvana Shatakam, whichever you call it. Na punyam, na papam, na saukyam, na dukkham, na mantro, na titam, na veda, na yajna. Aham bhojanam, naiva bhojyam, na bhokta, chidananda rupa, shivoham, shivoham. Thank you so much for listening. Come back tomorrow for Sutra number 7.